Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we jump into one of the most horrifying and disturbing stories from pre-Civil War Louisiana, I need you to do me a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with someone who loves dark historical tales and leave a comment telling me what state or country you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to follow this series because what I'm about to share will haunt your mind for days. Now let's go back to 1841, into the stifling heat of Louisiana's cotton fields, where two young girls were about to become the most feared figures in the entire region. My name is Zara, and this is the story my sister and I never wanted to tell, but one that must be heard. It began on a Tuesday morning when the August heat made the air so heavy you could barely breathe, and the cotton fields stretched endlessly under a merciless sun that seemed to scorch everything it touched. I was 12, Muriel was 10, and we had just finished our morning chores when we heard the screaming. Not the usual sounds of punishment echoing across the plantation. This was different. This was our mama's voice, raw and desperate, cutting through the humid air like a knife through skin. We dropped our water buckets and ran toward the main house, our bare feet slapping against the red dirt that stained everything in this cursed place. The other slaves watched us with eyes full of fear and sorrow, their faces already showing what we hoped wasn't true. Master Bogard stood on his wraparound porch, his white linen suit spotless despite the heat, holding a leather whip dripping with fresh blood. Below him, in the courtyard where the magnolia trees should have brought shade and beauty, our papa hung from thick ropes tied to the strongest branch. This is what happens, Bogard's voice boomed across the plantation, when property dares to steal from its owner. Our mama knelt in the dirt beneath Papa's swaying body. Her dress was torn, her back already marked with angry red welts that would scar forever. She wasn't crying anymore. The tears had been beaten out of her long ago. Now she just stared up at the man she had loved for 15 years, the father of her children. As his life slowly drained away, Muriel grabbed my hand so tightly I thought she might break my fingers, but I didn't pull away. We stood there, hidden behind the slave quarters, watching our world collapse in real time. I remember thinking this couldn't be real, that any moment we'd wake in our small cabin and Mama would be humming while preparing our meager breakfast. But this was real. The flies buzzing around Papa's wounds were real. The satisfied smile on Master Bogard's face was real. The way his wife, his children, and his guests watched from the porch like it was entertainment, that was real too. The boy tried to take bread for his sick children, whispered old Samuel, appearing beside us like a ghost. His weathered hands shook as he spoke. Master caught him near the kitchen before dawn. I felt something cold settle in my chest, something that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was like ice forming around my heart, protecting it from ever feeling this kind of pain again. Beside me, Muriel had gone completely still, her breathing so shallow I had to check twice to make sure she was alive. When they finally cut Papa down 3 hours later, Mama crawled to his body and held him until the sun set. No one tried to move her. Even Master Bogard seemed to understand that some grief was too heavy to interrupt. That night, Muriel and I sat with Mama in our cabin, listening to her broken whispers about how Papa had only wanted to feed us, how he had been saving scraps for weeks because we were getting thinner and thinner. She told us about the life they had dreamed of before being sold to this plantation, about the hopes they shared of freedom, of raising their children somewhere far from the cotton fields, the whips, and the endless crushing heat. "Promise me," Mama said, her voice barely audible in the darkness. "Promise me you'll survive this place. Promise me you'll be smarter than your papa and me." I promised. But even as the words left my lips, I knew I was lying. Survival wasn't enough anymore. The ice around my heart had spread to my veins, changing me, hardening me into something capable of more than just enduring. Muriel never spoke that night. She just stared at the wall where Papa had slept, her eyes reflecting the moonlight like wild animals. When I reached for her hand, her skin was cold as winter, and I realized that whatever had broken inside me had shattered completely inside her. The next morning we buried Papa in the slave cemetery beyond the cotton fields, where wooden crosses marked the graves of hundreds who had died on this plantation. Master Bogart didn't attend but sent his overseer to make sure we didn't spend too long grieving. As we walked back to the quarters, I noticed how the other slaves looked at us differently. Sympathy, yes, but also something else. Recognition that we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. We were no longer children. We were survivors of something that had killed the innocent parts of our souls. That afternoon, while Mama lay in bed staring at nothing, Muriel spoke her first words since Papa's death. "They're going to pay," she whispered so quietly I almost missed it. I looked at my little sister, noting how her jaw had set into a hard line that made her look years older, and I knew she was right. They were going to pay, all of them, for what they had stolen from us. The ice in my chest pulsed with something almost like warmth. But it wasn't warmth, it was rage, pure, cold, and patient, waiting for the right moment to burn everything down. From that day on, the other slaves called us the Silent Ones. We did our work without complaint, kept our heads down, and never caused trouble. But late at night, when the plantation slept, we sat together and planned. We were 12 and 10 years old, and we had just learned the world could kill good people for trying to feed their children. But we had also learned something else sometimes. To survive monsters, you must become something even more dangerous. The cotton fields whispered our names in the wind. Somewhere in the darkness, our future victims slept peacefully, unaware that their judgment day was being plotted by two little girls who had nothing left to lose. 6 years passed like a slow, burning fever, each day adding another layer to the ice around our hearts from the morning Papa died. I was 18, Muriel 16, and we had perfected the art of being invisible while seeing everything. Mama lasted 2 more years after Papa's death before grief finally claimed her. She died in her sleep one winter night, and I swear she was smiling when we found her, like she had finally found her way back to him. Master Bogart didn't even give us time to grieve. We were back in the fields the next morning, picking cotton until our fingers bled. But those 6 years hadn't been wasted. While the other slaves saw us as quiet, obedient sisters who never caused trouble, Muriel and I had been learning. We learned which floorboards creaked in the big house, which windows were never locked, and which of the white folks had secrets they would kill to protect. Most importantly, we learned about Overseer Marcus Webb. Webb was the man who had held the rope while Papa died, who had smiled while Mama screamed, who whispered in Master Bogart's ear that maybe the punishment should last longer just to make sure the other slaves knew their place. He was thin and weary, with pale eyes and hands always eager to reach for his whip. He lived at the edge of the plantation with his wife Sarah and their 3 children, all under 10. Sarah Webb was a nervous woman, always jumping at shadows, never looking the slaves directly in the eye, as if she knew her husband's cruelty would one day catch up with her. On the night we chose for our first act of justice, the air was thick with the promise of rain, and the cicadas sang so loudly they drowned almost every other sound. It was perfect. Nature itself was covering what we had to do. Muriel and I had spent months studying the Webb family's routines. Marcus always made his final rounds at 10:00, checking the slave quarters. Sarah put the children to bed at 8:30 and was usually asleep herself by 9:00. The house would be quiet and vulnerable by 1:15. We waited until the plantation settled into its nightly rhythm, then slipped out of our cabin like shadows. The other slaves were used to our midnight wanderings. They thought we went to Papa's grave to speak to his spirit. We never corrected them, let them think we were grieving daughters instead of predators stalking our prey. The Webb house sat about a quarter-mile from the main plantation buildings, surrounded by pecan trees that cast long dark shadows across the yard. We approached from the back where Sarah's vegetable garden provided cover and tested the kitchen door Marcus never locked. Inside, the house smelled like cornbread and fear. We could hear Marcus snoring in the front bedroom, a deep rumble that made my skin crawl. Sarah's breathing was lighter, restless, as if even in sleep she couldn't find peace. Muriel moved toward the children's room while I headed for the master bedroom. We had planned this moment for so long that we moved without hesitation, our bare feet silent on the wooden floors. I found Marcus first, sprawled across the bed like he owned the world, his mouth open and breath reeking of whiskey. Sarah lay curled on her side, as far from him as possible, her face peaceful in a way it never was during the day. For a moment I hesitated. Sarah had never directly hurt us. She was just a woman trapped in a life she probably hadn't chosen, married to a monster because that was what her father. But then I remembered Mama's screams, Papa's broken body, and the frozen knot in my chest flared with burning cold. I pushed the pillow over Sarah's face first, pressing down until her kicking slowed and her body went still. She never truly woke, never saw who ended her life. Marcus came next, and he did wake up. His pale eyes widened in pure terror when he saw my face lit by the moon spilling through the window. "You," he whispered, and I saw understanding spread across his face. "You're Samuel's girl." "Oh, I belong to no one," I said calmly, pressing the knife we had taken from the kitchen against his throat. "I'm your judgment." He fought back, tried to scream, but 6 years of hard labor had made me stronger than he expected. The fury I had carried for so long filled me with the strength of 10 men. When it ended, his blood soaked into the mattress where he had planned tomorrow's cruelty. Muriel stood in the doorway, her dress marked with small bloody handprints that would never fade. Her face was peaceful, almost calm, like she had finally recovered something that had been stolen from us years ago. "It's finished," she said softly. "We arranged the bodies with care, making it appear like a robbery gone wrong. We took jewelry, overturned furniture, and shattered a window from the inside. But we left a sign, a small carving cut into the wooden headboard, 2 interlocked circles symbolizing the bond between sisters that not even death could destroy. By dawn, we were back in our cabin, lying in our beds as if we had never left. When the screaming began an hour later and slaves came running to tell us about the horror at the Webb house, we acted perfectly. "Oh no," I cried, covering my mouth. "Who could do something so awful?" Muriel stared at the floor and stayed silent, exactly as everyone expected from the quiet sister who rarely spoke. Master Bogard sent for the sheriff, who searched the house for hours before declaring it the work of runaway slaves or swamp bandits. No one suspected the 2 grieving sisters who had been obedient slaves for 6 years. That night, as we lay listening to whispers ripple through the quarters, I felt something I had not felt since Papa died. Satisfaction. It was warm, sweet, and dangerous, like honey spread on fresh bread. Muriel reached across the gap between our beds and took my hand. "Who's next?" she murmured. I squeezed her fingers and smiled in the dark. We had tasted blood, and we wanted more. The Webb family was only the start. 3 more families remained on our list. 3 more groups who had played a part in Papa's death or Mama's suffering. And we had all the time we needed to plan their ends. The cotton fields carried our secret on the wind, and thunder rolled across the Louisiana sky like applause. The discovery of the Webb family sent shockwaves through the parish. But by the 3rd week, plantation life slipped back into its usual rhythm of cruelty and endurance. Master Bogard hired a new overseer, a savage man named Thomas Crenshaw, who made Marcus Webb seem kind. The cotton harvest continued under the unforgiving August sun, but Muriel and I were only beginning. Our second target was the Hartwell family, owners of the neighboring plantation. They had been present the day Papa died, laughing and sipping mint juleps as they watched him hang from the magnolia tree. Jonathan Hartwell was a bloated, sweating man who treated people like animals. His wife Margaret was famous for her inventive punishments. They had 2 teenage sons already learning their parents' cruelty, and a daughter who collected the ears of runaway slaves like keepsakes. They lived in a massive mansion with white columns and wide gardens, surrounded by endless cotton fields. We spent weeks studying their habits, learning their schedules, waiting patiently. Unlike the Webb house, the Hartwell estate was guarded by dogs and armed men. But every stronghold has weak points, and we were patient enough to find them. Our chance came during the Harvest Festival when the Hartwells hosted their yearly party for nearby plantation owners. The house overflowed with guests. Guards were distracted, and everyone was drunk on bourbon and praise. 2 slave girls slipping through shadows went unnoticed. We struck at midnight, when laughter and music masked every sound. The kitchen staff was too busy serving food to see us enter through the servants' door. Oil lamps cast dim light in the halls, creating perfect cover. Jonathan Hartwell was first, passed out in his study with a whiskey glass still in his hand. He never woke. Murrell's knife found his heart before his mind sensed danger. Margaret was harder. She was surrounded by her friends in the parlor, so we waited until she excused herself to freshen up. The upstairs bathroom was quiet, sealed by thick walls and heavy curtains. Margaret Hartwell died staring into my eyes, seeing herself reflected in the blade. Her final words were a prayer to a God who had never listened to the people she tortured. The children were the hardest part, not because of mercy that had frozen long ago, but because they were scattered among the guests. We had to be careful and precise. Robert Hartwell, the oldest son, died in the garden maze where he had dragged a slave girl to hurt her. He thought the party hid his actions. He was wrong. Morrill found him and made sure he would never harm another woman. Elizabeth, the daughter, died in her room while admiring jewelry taken from dead slaves. One necklace had belonged to our mama. The irony was perfect. I let her see it once more before ending her life. The youngest son, barely 14, was last. We found him hiding in the library reading about ancient Rome. When he looked up, I saw a sharp mind and a hunger that reminded me of myself. For a moment I hesitated. Then I remembered how he laughed when Papa died, clapping like it was a show. The hesitation vanished. Some sins are passed down, and some cycles only end in blood. When it was done, we placed the bodies in the parlor, seating them around the table like a family meal. This time we left more than a symbol. Using Jonathan Hartwell's blood, we wrote above the fireplace, "The children of the hanged man send their regards." We vanished into the night through the cotton fields while the party raged on below. The guests were too drunk to know their hosts lay dead upstairs. The bodies were found the next morning when servants returned to clean. Screams echoed for miles. By noon, every plantation buzzed with rumors. Some blamed abolitionists. Others spoke of bandits or runaways. A few whispered of curses and angry spirits. No one suspected two quiet slave girls whose hands were stained with cotton, not blood. Master Bogart held another meeting with the sheriff and plantation owners. They talked of more guards, more dogs, harsher control. But we were not rebels. We were something worse. We were born from the system, shaped by its violence, and turned back against it. That night, Muriel rolled toward me, moonlight shining in her eyes. "They're starting to understand," she said. "Understand what?" "That they aren't safe," she replied. "That there are consequences." She was right. Fear spread fast. White families locked doors, slept pistols, and watched shadows. In the slave quarters, whispers of justice grew. I saw something new in my people's eyes, hope. But we were not finished. Two families remained, the Beaumonts, owners of the largest plantation, and the Rousseau family, who supplied the rope that killed Papa. The Beaumonts were old Louisiana nobility, rich from generations of blood and cotton. Henry Beaumont was thin and polished, proud of his quiet cruelty. He never shouted or raged, but his punishments were famous for how long they lasted and how deeply they scarred. Here is a lightly rewritten version with small word changes only. The length is kept long, the flow is the same, there are no headings, and the language stays simple. Punctuation is rough and imperfect as requested. His wife Celeste was a former belle from New Orleans who brought her own cruel kind of pleasure to the plantation. They had 4 children between the ages of 8 and 22, and every one of them had been carefully taught to see slaves as something less than human. The oldest son, Philip, already controlled his own part of the land and was known for pushing slaves until they dropped dead during harvest time. The Rousseau family was not the same kind of people. They were traders, not landowners, but they supplied rope, chains, and other tools of suffering to every plantation in the parish. Claude Rousseau himself had delivered the rope used to hang Papa, and had stayed to watch like it was a show put on just for him. We chose to strike both families on the same night during the new moon, when the darkness would hide us best. It would be the boldest thing we had ever done, and it demanded perfect timing and no mistakes. The Beaumont plantation was heavily guarded, but we had watched their patterns for months. Guards walked their routes every 2 hours, and there was a 15-minute gap when the back of the house was left open. We would need to move fast and act without doubt. We began with the Rousseau family, who lived above their rope and chain shop in town. Claude Rousseau was a widower who lived with only his old mother and his teenage nephew, which made things much easier. We entered through the shop using tools stolen from the plantation blacksmith to open the back lock. The smell of hemp and iron filled the room, mixed with something else, a stale sense of fear and misery that clung to everything they touched. Claude Rousseau died in his bed without waking, never knowing what came for him. His mother lived long enough to see my face in the lamplight, and I made sure she knew why she was dying before Mel knife reached her heart. The nephew tried to escape, but the house was too small and his screams were swallowed by thick walls built to hold other people's pain. We carved our mark into the wooden counter and left behind a piece of the same rope used to kill Papa. Then we vanished into the night, crossing town toward the Beaumont plantation. The mansion stood on a hill above the river, its white columns shining in starlight like the bones of some old dead animal. We came from the riverside where cypress trees hid us and guards almost never walked. Getting inside was harder than we expected. After the earlier deaths, the Beaumonts had tightened security, and we waited nearly an hour for the right moment. But patience was our sharpest weapon, and finally the guards moved, leaving us a small opening. We entered through the conservatory where Celeste Beaumont kept her prized orchids in a glass room that stayed warm even in winter. The flowers seemed to stare as we passed, their strange blooms like eyes watching from the dark. Henry Beaumont was in his study working late over plantation books by lamplight. He looked up as we entered, and for a second his face showed only mild interest, like he did not understand what he saw. "You are Samuel's daughters," he said calmly. "I remember you from the day your father died." "Good," I said, stepping closer. "Then you know why we are here." He reached for the pistol in his desk, but Morel was quicker. Her knife struck his wrist and the gun fell as he cried out in pain and shock. "Your father was a thief," he gasped. "He stole food that belonged to me. He was feeding his children." Morel said, her voice cold like winter air. "Something you never understood. We did not rush Henry Beaumont. We made sure he felt every second and knew this was payment for every slave he hurt, every family he broke, every life he took for profit." Celeste Beaumont died in her bedroom, surrounded by silk dresses and jewels bought with blood money. She begged, promised freedom and gold if we spared her. But we learned long ago that white promises were worth less than the cotton we picked. The children were spread through the house, and we hunted them slowly, room by room, like wolves thinning a herd. Philip tried to fight with a sword passed down from his grandfather, but soft living had made him weak and the blade heavy in his hands. The youngest, a girl of 8, was the hardest. Not because she was innocent. We had seen her throw stones at slave children and laugh at their tears. But she reminded me of what Morel and I once were before the world showed its true face. Mercy was something we could not afford, and innocence died with Papa on that magnolia tree. When it ended, we placed the bodies in the grand ballroom around the piano where Celeste once played songs about the romance of the Old South. We wrote our message on the wall in Henry blood. "The rope you sold has come home." We walked out the front door like owners of the place and vanished into the cotton fields as dawn slowly rose. When the bodies were found, we were back in our cabin sleeping while the white world exploded in fear. 4 families gone, dozens of lives ended, and still no one suspected the 2 quiet slave girls picking cotton, hands stained with plants, not blood. But fear was spreading, changing everything. White folks fled the parish, selling land and running to safer places. Those who stayed lived like prisoners, afraid to sleep, afraid of shadows, afraid of judgment. The system that made us was starting to eat itself, and we were only beginning. The deaths of 4 powerful families in under 2 months turned the parish from polite gentility into a place of terror and suspicion. White men who once ruled like kings now moved in armed groups, eyes always searching the dark. Master Bogard tripled the guards and brought in bloodhounds trained to hunt runaways. But what he truly wanted was worse. He wanted men who hunted people. The bounty hunters arrived on a Tuesday morning, heavy air promising rain, cotton fields stretching under a gray sky like a burial cloth. There were 5 of them, hard men, cold eyes, hands near weapons. Their leader, Jeremiah Cross, was tall, thin, wore a black coat despite the heat, and carried a rifle that seemed soaked in death. He was known across the South for tracking runaways dead or alive, mostly dead. The others matched him. Marcus Stone, a former soldier tired of real war. Billy Tate, young with empty eyes, who killed for joy. Samuel Wright, an ex-overseer fired for cruelty. Thomas Kane, a tracker who could follow trails through swamp that would confuse any brave soul. They took over the old tobacco barn, turning it into a fortress with gun holes and clear views. Master Bogard gave them full power to question, search, and punish however they wished. But Morrill and I had prepared since the night we killed the Webb family. We knew someone worse would come. We studied the swamp beside the plantation, learning its paths, waters, and tricks. The Atchafalaya swamp was a maze of cypress moss, hidden channels, and floating land that shifted with water levels. Even skilled hunters vanished there. Gators and snakes ruled places older than memory. And most important, it was a land where white rules failed, where someone could disappear and return changed by old dark magic in water and trees. The bounty hunters began by questioning slaves using methods meant to break spirits. Old Samuel was hung by his thumbs, revived and hung again. Young Mary was whipped until her back was raw. Still the quarters stayed silent even without knowing who they protected. They knew helping white power only brought pain. Jeremiah Cross grew angry and more violent. He dragged slaves into the swamp and left their bodies as warnings, hoping fear would crack the silence. But he made one fatal mistake. He stepped into our land, the place where we punctuation held every advantage, and he was just another wandering soul lost in the shadows. We struck on the third night of their hunt, when Thomas Kane believed he was tracking our trail through the deepest, most tangled part of the swamp. He was skilled, following subtle signs that most men would overlook, but he was hunting ghosts and shadows, tracing a path we had set for him like breadcrumbs leading straight to a trap. The water was chest deep when we took him, rising like the spirits of the drowned from the black swamp. He never had a chance to scream, never had a chance to reach for his weapons. One moment he was examining broken twigs and crushed moss. The next he was sinking beneath the surface, Murrell's knife buried deep between his ribs. We left his body floating face down in a small clearing where the others would eventually find it, but not before we had taken his scalp and carved our mark into his forehead. Let them remember that the hunters had become the hunted, that their prey was far deadlier than they ever imagined. Billy Tate was next. We caught him while he relieved himself behind a cypress tree older than the plantation itself. We hung him from the Spanish moss like some grotesque holiday ornament, his body swaying in the humid breeze while the alligators below gathered, drawn by the smell of blood. Samuel Wright lasted longer than the rest, managing to graze Morrill with a lucky shot from his pistol before I slit his throat with the knife we had taken from the plantation's kitchen. But his death was messier than we preferred, and we had to work swiftly to rearrange his body before the others came searching. Marcus Stone was the cleverest of the group, smart enough to realize they were being picked off one by an enemy who knew the swamp better than they knew their own names. He tried to convince Jeremiah Cross to retreat, to call for reinforcements, to admit they were outmatched. But Cross was too proud and too greedy to admit defeat. The bounty on our heads had grown to 1,000 each, enough to buy a modest plantation, and he could already taste the riches he imagined would come with our capture. He made his final mistake on the seventh night, choosing to hunt us alone. Confident that his skills and experience would be enough to overpower two slave girls who had only survived by luck against his less capable companions, we found him at dawn. He sat against a cypress tree, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the water for movement. He looked like a statue carved from stone, patient, deadly, utterly certain of his own invincibility. But statues don't bleed. Jeremiah Cross discovered this truth when Murrell's arrow pierced his chest from behind, pinning him to the tree like a butterfly in a collector's case. He lived long enough to see us emerge from the water, long enough to understand he had been outmatched from the very start, long enough to realize that the monsters he had been hunting were far more lethal than anything he had faced. "Who are you?" he whispered, blood frothing at his lips. "Why are the daughters of the man you came to avenge?" I said, kneeling beside him as his life slipped away. "We are the children of your nightmares." When it was over, We arranged the bodies of all 5 bounty hunters in a circle around their camp, like they were holding a final meeting in hell. Our symbol was carved into the barn door, accompanied by a message written in Jeremiah Cross's blood. The swamp remembers everything. Then we melted back into the dark water, leaving no trace, becoming one with the ancient spirits that had always ruled this place. The discovery of the bounty hunters' bodies sent shockwaves across the South. These were men who had never failed to bring back their prey. Men feared from Virginia to Texas, now slaughtered like lambs by an enemy invisible and untouchable. Master Bogard stopped hiring outside help after that. The warning was clear: anyone hunting us would become part of the growing collection of bodies marking our territory. The swamp had claimed its tribute, and we were its most devoted servants. The massacre had pushed Master Bogard and the other plantation owners beyond the edge of rational thought. Fear had transformed them into desperate, dangerous creatures, like cornered beasts willing to destroy everything rather than admit defeat. 3 weeks after Jeremiah Cross and his men had fed the alligators in the swamp, Bogard summoned every white man in the parish who could bear arms. They assembled at the main house like generals planning war. Their voices echoed across the plantation as they debated the best way to root out the cancer ruining their way of life. I watched from the cotton fields as carriages and horses arrived, carrying plantation owners, overseers, merchants, and even the sheriff from town. By evening, nearly 50 armed men filled Bogard's parlor, drinking whiskey and stirring themselves into a frenzy of righteous anger. Their plan was brutal and simple. They would surround the slave quarters and demand we be handed over. If the slaves refused, they would burn the quarters and shoot anyone who tried to flee. They believed the other slaves were shielding us, hiding us, helping plan our attacks. And they weren't entirely wrong. Most slaves didn't know Moral and I were the killers, but they instinctively closed ranks around us, like prey protecting their young from predators. They had long understood that survival meant solidarity, that betraying one of their own to white authority was a sin that could never be forgiven. But the white men did not understand that their plan would produce the opposite of what they intended. Rather than isolate us, it would turn every slave on the plantation into our ally, transforming a secret war into open rebellion. The siege began at dawn on a Sunday, while mist clung to the ground like ghosts of all the slaves who had perished on this cursed land. The white men surrounded the quarters with military precision, hiding behind cotton bales and farm tools, rifles trained on the cabins where nearly 200 slaves lived in conditions that would shame even a dog kennel. Master Bogard stepped forward with a white flag on a stick, pretending civility even as he prepared mass murder. "You know why we are here," he called, voice cutting across the silent quarters. "We want the 2 women who have been killing white families. Turn them over and the rest of you will be spared." The silence was deafening. No doors opened. No voices answered. The slaves had made their choice, and it was not the one the white men expected. Old Samuel, who had survived the bounty hunters' interrogations despite being beaten nearly to death, finally stepped out of his cabin. He walked slowly, back straight despite age and injury, dignity intact despite years of abuse. "Master Bogard," he said, voice heavy with 70 years of suffering, "we don't know nothing about no killers. We just slaves trying to survive another day in this hell you made. Don't lie to me, old man." Bogard snarled, his civilized mask slipping. "Those women are hiding among you and you're protecting them. One last chance. Do the right thing." Samuel looked at the faces of his people, the children peeking from skirts, the young men with hands already inching toward farm tools that could serve as weapons. "The right thing," he said slowly. Then, for the first time in decades, he smiled. "Master, I reckon we got different ideas of what's right." Bogard gave the order to fire. The first volley shattered the morning air like thunder, splintering cabin walls, forcing the slaves back into cover. But instead of cowering, they fought. They came from their cabins with axes, hammers, knives, and pitchforks, anything they could use. Years of beatings and abuse had left them ready, and death in battle now seemed preferable to continued slavery. Young Marcus, from the blacksmith shop, hurled a bag of horseshoes with deadly precision, each hitting its mark with a satisfying crack. Women joined, hurling boiling water and swinging cast iron skillets like maces. Children ran between cabins, delivering messages and ammunition, their small size making them nearly impossible to hit. The white men had superior weapons and training, and slowly they pushed the slaves toward the center. Bodies fell on both sides, but for every white man killed, 3 slaves joined him in death. That's when Muriel and I emerged. From the swamp we had been hiding since before dawn, waiting for this exact moment. We moved like shadows given form, like death walking among the living, and the white men's attention shifted to us. Like iron filings pulled to a magnet, we were drawn into the chaos. "Thier," Bogard screamed, shaking his finger at us, trembling with rage. "There are your killers. Take them alive if you can, but take them." The fight that followed was unlike anything ever witnessed on a Louisiana plantation. We moved through the violence like dancers in a deadly, twisted ballet, our blades finding their marks with unerring precision, while the enslaved people around us found courage they hadn't known they possessed. I drove my knife into the heart of Thomas Crenshaw, the overseer who had replaced Marcus Webb, and watched his eyes widen in disbelief as he realized the hunted had learned to fight back. Morrill struck down 2 neighboring plantation owners with throws that would have amazed a circus juggler, her knives spinning through the air like deadly birds of prey. But numbers and guns weighed heavily against us, and eventually their superiority began to show. A rifle shot tore into my shoulder, spinning me into the side of a cabin. Another grazed Mel's temple, leaving a streak of blood that transformed her into a war goddess from some forgotten legend. The slaves were falling too, their bravery no match for the merciless firepower. Old Samuel collapsed with 3 bullets in his chest, yet his hammer swung even in death at the men who had tormented him for 70 years. Young Marcus shielded a cluster of children and died, riddled with bullets, his spirit still unbroken. As the sun climbed higher, the grim truth became clear: this would be our final battle. We were trapped in the center of the quarters, surrounded by fallen and dying slaves facing an enemy 10 times our number. But something irreversible had been achieved. We had shown the enslaved people that their oppressors could bleed, could die, could be made to pay for cruelty. We had planted a seed of rebellion that would grow long after our own bodies fed the Louisiana soil. Master Bogard approached slowly, his rifle leveled at my chest, his face flushed with triumph and bloodlust. "It's over," he panted. "You've caused enough trouble for one lifetime." I looked at the destruction we had wrought, the bodies of slaves and masters intermingled in death, and I smiled. "No," I said, feeling cold fire pulse through me one last time. "It's only the beginning." The cotton fields whispered our names on the wind, and on the horizon storm clouds gathered like a restless army of the dead, preparing for the next charge. The siege of the slave quarters ended with our capture, but not our defeat. As Bogard and his remaining men dragged us toward the main house, I saw it in the eyes of the slaves who survived, a spark that hadn't existed before, a flame no cruelty could snuff out. They had seen their oppressors bleed. They had witnessed white men die by black hands. They had glimpsed the possibility of freedom, even at immense cost. Bogard locked us in the root cellar beneath the main house, a damp, suffocating space smelling of rotting vegetables and despair. Our hands were bound with the same rope that had hanged Papa, a detail he surely believed poetic justice. What he did not realize was that we had prepared for this moment ever since the night we killed the Webb family. Hidden in our dresses were small vials of lamp oil, accumulated secretly over months. Sewn into Morrill's skirt was flint and steel stolen from the blacksmith shop. Our war had always been meant to end in fire. Night fell over the plantation, bringing an uneasy silence. The root cellar lay beneath the main house's kitchen, the wooden floor above dry and brittle from decades of Louisiana heat. "Are you ready?" Morrill whispered. I thought of Papa hanging from the magnolia tree, Mama dying of a broken heart, the slaves who had suffered and died, the children who might grow up free if we succeeded. "I've been ready since I was 12, I answered. We worked quietly, using our teeth to tear open the vials and smear the oil across the wooden ceiling. Its sharp, acrid scent mixed with the musty cellar air, filling the space with an electric tension. When the oil was in place, Morrill struck flint against steel, sparks dancing like fireflies. After several attempts, a tiny flame caught, licking at the oil-soaked wood. At first slow, the fire grew, devouring the dry timbers above, its heat pressing down on our underground prison. But we had no intention of dying there. The root cellar, built in the plantation's early days, connected to tunnels that led to the river, roads constructed by long-dead owners never used. We had discovered and prepared them months ago. As the flames devoured the house above, we crawled through narrow tunnels, following the path toward the dark waters of the Akifalaya. Behind us, the screams began as the fire consumed the main house. Bogart and his family were trapped on the upper floors, cut off by the very flames they thought would keep us imprisoned. The same fire once used to brand slaves and heat irons was now claiming the lives of their oppressors. We emerged at the riverbank where a small boat waited, hidden in the reeds with supplies for our journey into the swamp. As we pushed off, the plantation burned behind us, flames shooting toward the sky like the prayers of those who had died in bondage. The main house was a ruin, columns cracking and collapsing, while the surviving slaves burned the quarters rather than continue in chains. Shadows ran through smoke and fire, some fighting, some fleeing, but no one could escape judgment. Drifting into the swamp, gunshots echoed across the water. The surviving slaves fought back with weapons scavenged from the dead, turning the plantation into a battlefield where old rules no longer applied. Some died, others vanished into the swamp along paths we had shown them, carrying our story, proof that resistance was possible. The fires burned for 3 days, consuming outbuildings, the cotton crop, and leaving charred ruins where magnolia trees once stood. Bogart's body was found in his study, burned beyond recognition, still clutching the whip he had used to terrorize slaves. His family perished with him, trapped by the inferno they had thought would hold us. Authorities scoured the swamps for months, offering rewards, sending tracking parties. The Akafalaya swallowed us completely, making us part of its ancient, endless secrets. Some say we perished, consumed by the swamp's violence. Others whisper that we escaped north to freedom. Few claim we are still out there, moving through dark waters like vengeful spirits, waiting. The truth is simpler and more profound. We became what we were meant to be. Legends, symbols. Proof that even the most oppressed can rise when pushed past their limits. The plantation system endured another 20 years, but never as before. Fear had been planted, and it spread. When the Civil War came, many enslaved people carried our story into battle, remembering the sisters who showed that oppressors could bleed, could die, could be forced to pay. In the deep Louisiana swamps where cypress trees rise and Spanish moss drapes between worlds, our spirits still whisper to those brave enough to hear. We are daughters of the hanged man, children of a system that devoured itself. We are proof that some fires once lit never die. The cotton fields remember our names, the wind carries our story. The legend of Zara and Morrill spread across the South after the Beauregard plantation burned. Some called them monsters, others heroes, but all agreed they changed the unchangeable. Oppression always sows the seeds of its own undoing, and sometimes the deadliest enemies are born from the system itself. Even today, in the misty swamps of Louisiana, locals say 2 figures move through the fog on moonless nights, hunting those who would enslave the innocent. Ghosts, legends, or something beyond both, their message is clear: justice may be delayed, but it will never be denied.